We still do 7 NUFC Matters show a week for free. But if you want to help support NUFC Matters, then there are a few ways of doing it. Hit the like button on each live broadcast and video. This helps the channel grow. Hit the subscribe button and select the all notifications bell so you don't miss a single show. If you want to help us financially, then you can join the channel using this button with the membership starting at $1.99 a month. Or you can drop us a donation in the chat using a super sticker. We're also looking for sponsors. If you'd like your brand advertised on the flyers for the show and featured during the ad break, then email John at nufcmatters.com to arrange today. Good morning, welcome to NUFC Matters with me, Steve Wraith. It is a pre-recorded show with Ben Jacobs, who delighted to welcome back to the show. Happy New Year, Ben.
Yeah, Happy New Year, Steve, and to everyone listening as well. Hope it's full of success for all of the listeners, yourself, and of course for Newcastle.
Yes, fingers crossed. And as this is pre-recorded, it's going out on the morning of the derby. Sunderland taking on Newcastle United at the Stadium of Light, 12:45 kickoff. Live on terrestrial TV, which means those people who don't have Sky at last get a cracker to watch on TV. Let's talk about that first, Ben, before we look at the transfers. Lots of questions have come in on X today, so I'll worm my way through them. But 8 years since we played Sunderland, not through any fault of our own. Sunderland, when we dropped into the Championship, had decided to go one division further. So that's why there's been such a gap in derby games. It's finally poised, 53 wins each. Local pride at stake, though, Ben. It's a huge game.
It's a massive game, and it's a massive tournament for Newcastle as well, because they're out of Europe. It's a chance to win a trophy. So, you know, Eddie Howe has to take it seriously. There can't be too much chopping and changing when you go away at Sunderland, or maybe it's home to Sunderland, given the Black Cats bar got totally designed and bizarrely in Newcastle colours, where the Newcastle fans in hospitality will be. But anyway, you got to go away. There's bragging rights at stake. As you say, there's 7 years since the last time we're derby. It's a massive game. And I think that it's exactly what Newcastle need, really, an opportunity to play in a hostile atmosphere, pull out, hopefully, from their perspective, a result that can kickstart their 2024. And with Newcastle losing in dramatic circumstances to Chelsea in the League Cup, and that's interesting, by the way, because, of course, the draw gave Chelsea Borough. So if Newcastle had hang on for an extra minute, then they might have had a derby against Borough and a derby against Sunderland in the same season as well. But I felt like the League Cup was a really good opportunity for Newcastle to win a trophy and guarantee, therefore, some kind of European football. And now they've got to build in the FA Cup. And with it only being the third round, we can't get too carried away. But you win the derby, it gives you momentum. You lose the derby, suddenly it's home to Manchester City, difficult. It's away at Aston Villa, difficult. And then you're into February, and even though the likes of Luton and I think Forest and Bournemouth are to come, maybe Newcastle fans start thinking by February they're 9th, 10th in the table, they're 7, 8, 9, 10 points off Champions League football. Has momentum gone for the season? So this is really important for impetus, not just bragging rights that Newcastle get a result.
Where do you see this game in terms of derbies, Ben? You know, we've got Celtic Rangers, you've got Liverpool Everton, you've got Villa against Birmingham. You know, where does it rate for you?
Well, I think that where it rates for me is irrelevant compared to fans, and a derby and the beauty of it is defined by the fact that to fans of the two clubs or those in the region, it's the biggest derby around. And sometimes we kind of hear neutrals say, or journalists, that was the best derby atmosphere I've seen. That's the most intense derby. I can't believe how different or special that derby was. And of course, you can judge it on atmosphere and noise and pre-match hype and media coverage and what's at stake as well. And I like it when you get a derby in the FA Cup because it's a winner takes all, whereas in the league, the rivalry can mean something, but there might not be anything at stake when the game is played. So I think ranking derbies is tough. And for me anyway, it can be a bit disrespectful because this is the biggest derby as far as Newcastle and Sunderland fans are concerned. I think I'm right in saying, correct me if I'm wrong, Steve, that this derby would be bigger than Newcastle against Middlesbrough, for example. Much bigger. So you then have to look at the Newcastle fan base, and you also have to give the Sunderland fan base credit as well, because even when they dropped down a couple of divisions, they were still really well supported as well, and say they'll generate an atmosphere, there'll be an intensity, and it's all people are talking about in the Northeast. So, of course, if you look at other global derbies, whether we're talking about a Manchester one or a Liverpool-Manchester United or a Classico, I suppose in media coverage, in attendances, in frequency and things on the line, they're bigger if we're being really objective. But it doesn't matter because this is all that matters to Newcastle and Sunderland fans. So it's the biggest derby around. And I've been to a number of these time where derbies. I remember, for example, going all the way back to the sort of early 2010s to Newcastle's 5-1 victory over Sunderland, which was in the Premier League. And the atmosphere was absolutely incredible. That was the game, by the way, where Kevin Nolan scored a hat-trick. And I think from memory, Shola Amiobi got on the score sheet as well. And there was a moment really late on when it would have been Darren Bent, I believe. Apologies if I got that wrong, Sunderland fans. He got a 90th minute consolation, and there was this sort of jeering from the Newcastle fans that totally drowned out the half-hearted cheers from the Sunderland ones, and it just created a really nice moment. And we know about the sort of cheer up Peter Reid chants and so on. So it's a fantastic derby. And in addition to that, the other point that I want to make, which gives it a little bit of spice heading into this game, is that Sunderland have got a really, really good record against Newcastle of late. So that's another thing that Newcastle will want to change. I think you have to go back to maybe 2011, I might be right in saying, to even find Newcastle's last victory. So Sunderland were on this kind of winning run, I think anyway, and they had this knack of beating Newcastle and keeping clean sheets against Newcastle. And I think Newcastle's last success in terms of taking something from a game was in the last meeting. That was the 1-1. But prior to that, they were really struggling. So they need to kind of change that narrative. Because again, if you go back to the earlier part of the century, it was a formality for Newcastle United to be taking points off Sunderland and usually beating Sunderland. And they were the ones keeping clean sheets. They were the ones that were scoring goals. I remember probably would have been 2005, 2006, Newcastle going away at Sunderland and getting a comprehensive 4-1 victory, even though they were down in that game, and they scored a blitz of goals, including a Shearer penalty in the space of about 6 or 7 minutes in the second half, and they totally dominated. And that was part of a run from probably 2001 or so to about 2008, 2009, where Newcastle barely lost a game. But the momentum feels like it sort of shifted in the Premier League meetings anyway between the sides. And Sunderland just had a knack of coming to Newcastle and winning games. There were a couple of 3-0 victories, weren't there, at St James's Park in the space of back-to-back seasons, or relatively close together anyway. So Newcastle won't have forgotten that, which is why they need to turn up and put in a big performance, because they're expected to win the game, and they're probably expected to win the game comfortably as well, even though Sunderland are doing okay this season. So this is a really important game.
Yeah, huge game, big game, and one that I'm looking forward to. One thing that concerns me, and not just about this game, but about the FA Cup in general. We saw on Thursday night Crystal Palace versus Everton, and a controversial VAR decision, something we've talked about on this show before. Newcastle travelled to the Stadium Light today, Saturday, and essentially there's no VAR. Now, Sunderland do have the capability of using VAR, but because it's not a Premier League ground, it's not fixed in place. But they do have the technology. They could have done it, but it's not happening. Now, I don't agree, Ben, with having some games in the third round having VAR and other games not, because ultimately that's not really a fair playing field. Because should, for example, a team get knocked out because of a controversial VAR decision or a VAR decision, yet there's a game like Newcastle against Sunderland where there is something which clearly would have been chalked off by VAR, but wasn't, and that team goes through. That's not really fair, Ben.
Yeah, I mean, I said this as well, by the way, in other sports with Wimbledon, where you have Hawkeye on the main two courts in tennis and not on all of the outside courts. So depending on where you're drawn, you're either given an advantage of technology or a disadvantage of a lack of technology. I completely agree with you. The FA Cup would be impossible to put VAR across the board, especially at this stage of the tournament. And I think, therefore, if you're going to be fair, there should be no VAR. There's no VAR, for example, in the League Cup. We saw Chelsea play a game in the League Cup and VAR was not there, even though that is a Premier League stadium. And that's seen as somehow for consistency and fairness. So my feeling is there should be no VAR anywhere. And that at least levels the playing field and gives everyone a chance. And I always find it quite interesting in the FA Cup when there is no VAR, because for all of the complaints about VAR, what we see when there's no VAR is people moaning, I can't believe that was missed. VAR would have caught that. So one of the biggest compliments to VAR, despite all of its critics and despite the fact that those running VAR need training and many of the rules need changing, so there's a lot to be done. But one of the biggest compliments to the technology itself is when it is missing, in many ways, it is missed. And I think that does tell you that there are improvements and that it will end up being beneficial to football. It's just now it's slow. There's a lack of communication. The people running it are not consistent. I mean, you look at last night and the sending off in the Everton Palace game, ridiculous. Never a red for Dominic Calvert-Lewin in a million years. But they slowed that down. And when you look at a couple of frames in slow motion, you see the high foot. And as soon as the ref goes to the screen, you know he's going to give that as a red. So maybe you can only look at that, in my opinion anyway, in real time. Why did you slow it down? Why did you freeze frame it? Because that's not the nature of the game. The referee is not meant to be a robot. The referee is meant to officiate based on their opinion and with a guideline of the rules. So that's done in real time. So you also should be factoring in the pace of the game, the spirit of the game, and the video footage helps. And I thought that sending off was ridiculous. So that's a negative for me for VAR. But the positive is it will pick up all of the basics like offside, which can be forensic and can be clear cut. So I agree with you. I think that it should be consistent. And if you can't have it consistent in a tournament like the FA Cup, you've got to remove it. And it's interesting as well for officials because they're ingrained now to use VAR, which I think is a negative as a kind of safety net. And they're ingrained to let the play go on and then almost let VAR decide at times, certainly with offside. And then if you're the same official doing the Tyne derby, you can't do that anymore. And your brain is automatically thinking, let the play run, let the play run. But an official without VAR needs to realign their head and say, I've actually got to make a split-second decision that's going to be definitive, so I've got to stick my flag up or not. And I wonder whether inadvertently we're going to see a bit more kind of caution from officials, because they're so used to not being trigger happy. And you can't do that in this kind of game. You've got to make it absolutely clear instantly. And I've said many times that I like the offside flag going up early, whether right or wrong. And the whole point of semi-automatic offsides is to try and get it right. But in this context, there's no technology. So you've got to be definitive. And the beauty of being definitive is that we never know the consequences. So we can moan about it, and definitely people will. But as long as the flag goes up early without VAR, you don't know whether your player going clean through would or wouldn't have scored, because everything just stops. So you can say, oh, VAR should have intervened. Oh, we were robbed. And you're going to have that in the immediate aftermath, but it will die down a lot quicker, because you don't even know whether a finish would have happened. You don't know if the keeper would have saved it. You don't know whether the player would have slipped. You don't know whether the defender would have got back. So is it really worth moaning about over and over again? Or can you just live with the fact that it was probably offside, or it was tight, or it was a mistake, but was any damage done? You don't know, because everyone just stopped. And I think that officials need to still carry that authority. If they can be aided by semi-automatic offsides and technology, great. But if they can't, they're there for a reason. And what's the point in having these officials if they're going to be cautious, if they're going to be half-hearted, if they're not going to give us what they think? That's what they're paid for. They're not paid to just wait for technology and confirm technology. They're paid to use their experience and training within the framework of the rules to officiate a football match. And we're going to see that in the Tyne derby. And hopefully they do a good job without leaning on the crutch of technology, because, as you say, they can't.
Okay, we'll come back to the game a little bit later on, because I did ask those people who are on X and on Facebook if they had any questions with regards to transfers. Of course, Ben has his ear to the ground, like all good journalists, and picks up a few home truths about what could or could not happen. But as I say, it's Ben's opinion. So please don't take it as gospel. We always say that whenever we have a guest on here. It's only an assumption, unless he has some concrete facts, we will say. Tom Dixon says, question for Ben. Do you think Calvin Phillips will come to Newcastle, or do you think he'll go elsewhere? And Rich Joblin said, a few journalists feel Calvin Phillips wants the Newcastle United move, and the issue is with the loan fee. He said, but you seem to suggest we aren't even in talks. Have you got any further updates?
Yeah, I mean, that's my understanding at the time of recording. Things can change very quickly, but we're recording this one on the morning of the 5th of January. And contrary to some reports, or even internal optimism at Newcastle, I'm told they've made no approach. So this notion they somehow know all of Manchester City's terms, I think, is being exaggerated at this point. And it's premature to speak about Newcastle and Calvin Phillips, because I don't think that they've started any talks in a club-to-club sense with Manchester City. And I was told that at the back end of the year, and that was reiterated to me again, that Juventus are the only club that have formally explored a move at this stage for Calvin Phillips. So it's obvious that things can change. And it's obvious as well that the longer Phillips stays at Manchester City, the more Manchester City might have to bend and provide a straight loan, or maybe a loan with an option, which would suit Newcastle. And there's also no doubt that Newcastle have considered Calvin Phillips, but I'm not sure that it's advanced to the degree that others are suggesting. And again, because it's a quick window, in a day, a week, it could change. But it's factually incorrect, to my knowledge, reiterated from all sides, that as of today, maybe it'll change this afternoon, maybe it'll change tomorrow, it's a long window, but as of today, I'm still told that they've not started anything. They've made no formal approach. You can informally explore it on the player side. You can informally work out terms of a deal, it's true, but there's nothing really advanced on the Newcastle side yet. And there's no guarantee that there even will be. So I think people are putting a neat 2 and 2 together and saying, Phillips needs game time, Newcastle need a midfielder, he's available on loan, it'll probably get done. And it may be true that within Newcastle, there is an optimism that were they to move, they might be able to thrash something out. But Juventus are the only club talking at the moment. And even they are struggling to agree anything with Manchester City. And I think it's actually through Juventus and their inability to get a straight loan that others are presuming that Newcastle are struggling, when Newcastle actually, to my knowledge, have done nothing formal yet on this. And let's wait and see whether that changes during the window. And then we hear about PSG as well. And I'm told that that is nonsense and that PSG are also not in the race for Calvin Phillips. So it's a strange one, because this is something that almost got so billed in the build-up to the opening of the window that people are just under the presumption that it's going to get done really quickly. And I'm not saying it won't, because there's a long time left in the window. But if it was true in the build-up to the window that Newcastle were definitely going to move, that Newcastle definitely thought they could get a loan, they'd have already done it, because those are the kind of signings that you try and wrap up on day one of the window. And that's why we get a flurry of business now, because clubs are working to pre-agree things for when the window opens. If you get to now, Friday, January the 5th, with a game in the FA Cup and probably not that much movement until Monday next week and onwards, if you get into the second week in January and your business still isn't done, it probably tells you that you're still considering things, or you're still working on things a bit later, and it's not a reflection of any pre-window work. Otherwise, you would have in likelihood already had it wrapped up. So it's still one to watch, I suppose, for Newcastle, because we know they might bring in a midfielder. But at the same time, I think that those suggesting talks are advanced, that there's a roadblock because Man City are asking for too much and Newcastle can't afford it, I think they're failing to understand the fact that my understanding is anyway, and I can only speak from my sources, no formal talks have actually started yet between Phillips and Newcastle. And let's wait and see whether that changes.
Okay, lots of paper talk about that one, has been for a while, but we will wait and see. Clearly needs a move from Man City, but will it be to Newcastle? We'll wait and see. Kenneth Wilson, he said, are we signing Stuttgart striker Serhou Guirassy? Does he have a release clause of 17.5 million?
Yeah, 17.5 million euros, though, so about 15 million quid. The release clause is accurate. And there's a few clubs looking. Newcastle are one of them, and also Manchester United are another. But I actually think, speaking to sources, I know we're starting off on a very negative front as far as business, but I think it will be quite a quiet window for Newcastle. So it's not like I'm pouring cold water over everything. And then people will naturally say, well, who are we signing? But the answer to that question might be nobody. It really is an if Newcastle sign, not a when Newcastle sign. So it's natural that there will be some pessimism almost about business within the market. And that, I think, is why Eddie Howe has reiterated that they might have to settle for loans. They might have to settle for nothing. Let's wait and see. And going out of Europe impacts things. But with Guirassy, it's not so much that Newcastle are pessimistic about the fact that he could be interested. It's more that I still think the odds are he'll stay at Stuttgart in January and then leave in the summer. And triggering the release clause is irrelevant if the player says, I'm not interested in leaving. So 17.5 million euros is a bargain price for a player that's got 19 goals in all competitions in just 16 games and 14 goals in the Bundesliga in only 17 games. But again, the player has to have buy-in. And my Stuttgart sources still feel like come the end of the window in January, he'll still be at the club. So it might be one that a Newcastle or a Manchester United try, or it might be one that they wait for until the summer. And as Eddie Howe has said, there's also no guarantee whatsoever that Newcastle even have 17.5 million euros. We're quite sort of glib, I think, in modern football as journalists and as fans, because you hear that number and you say, God, that's a bargain. But it's still 17.5 million euros. And if Newcastle feel that all they can do is loans, then they are 17.5 million euros short of the 17.5 euros they need to get the deal done. So it's not a given that they've even got that money, even if they wanted to trigger the release clause. And that's why I think when you look at it, and the fact that he's at the Africa Cup of Nations, so he's not going to be available until mid, or if you give him some time off late February, I'm not so sure that that one will happen. But the Newcastle interest is genuine nonetheless.
Okay, interesting. Dave Reese says, are we leaving the bulk of our business, do you think, until the summer, and therefore expect a quiet January. Eddie Howe in his press conference on Friday still maintaining that line that not going to be a great deal of business, and he's confident that he can turn things around with a squad of players that he will have returning at his disposal, and that loans will probably be what Newcastle are looking at this window.
Yeah, I think Howe's absolutely right. As I said before, Newcastle will look for loans or structures that allow them to stay within financial fair play. So loan is one example. Maybe it's loan with option, maybe it's loan with obligation, and the terms are more conducive to financial fair play. Or maybe it's a straight transfer, but just with more preferable payment terms that allow them to sign a player on a long-term contract, amortize the transfer fee over 5 years, and pay the installments over a little bit longer time period. So it's not just about loans, but it's about being creative to make sure that financially speaking, the books will add up and the club's cash flow will add up as well. And I think that Howe is well aware that this is a difficult window. The market is very much a seller's market. Newcastle are not guaranteed European football, certainly not Champions League football next season. They don't have Champions League in the second half of the season. Had they got Champions League in the second half of the season, it's more money, it's more depth needed. Then maybe they would have been more active in the market. But if you remember during the summer, when Newcastle had qualified for Champions League football, I made the point that you don't rock your model with one season of European football. You don't overspend, you don't increase your wage bill, you don't give every player at the club what they want because you've got success once. Because in the following season, if you don't get the same success, then you've over-projected financially speaking, and you get burned. And that's how you get into financial difficulty, because you are presuming success that comes with money that doesn't arrive. And that's why Newcastle's financial projections will probably only be top half of the Premier League. That's what they'll be budgeting on financially. And that's sensible. And Brighton will be the same. But Newcastle's football expectation is go and finish in the top 5, presuming 5th has Champions League football. So there's always that paradox where your financial ambition is conservative to make sure that your football club is sustainable, but your football ambition is obviously a lot higher, because it would be nuts for Newcastle to want to finish 10th in the league and say that's a football success. But it's very sensible for Newcastle to plan financially to be 10th in the league, because if they plan any higher with their budgets and then spend in windows and pay higher wages and so on, offer bonuses, offer contracts, they're going to be in big, big trouble. And I think this is why Newcastle's desire to grow and project is one thing, but Newcastle United's finances have to be another thing. Otherwise, they could take one step forwards based on last season and then 2 steps back. So it might not please the fan base to hear it, because they just want to spend. They want immediate success. They want to build on last season. But I actually think it's quite a positive that this ownership group are being really strict and stringent, because it tells you that it's a well-run club and that they know they can't get ahead of themselves financially speaking. Otherwise, it might come back to them in future seasons and bite them.
Yeah, interesting. Lots to discuss moving through this January transfer window. But as always, we are just coming up to the half-hour mark, and let's have the ads.
A big thanks to all our sponsors: Skips and Bins, telephone 0800 25 45 25 3, email inquiries at skipsandbins.com, website skipsandbins.com, easy contract free and pay-as-you-go waste collection. Thanks again to Mr. Vicky's Sauces, handmade in Cumbria. If you'd like to order some, then give them a call on 01768 210 102. Go to the website mrvickies.co.uk or drop them an email, info@mrvickies.co.uk. A big thanks to United Group Travel. They're a family firm based in Morpeth with pickups throughout the northeast. No strangers on our tours, just people you haven't met yet. They've got a presence on Facebook and a website, unitedgrouptravel.com. If you want to make a booking, give them a call on 01670 632 460 or mobiles 0791 666 4174 0795 71 41654. Thanks to Darren Baldwin Funerals, independent funeral directors. Let us look after you in your time of need. They're based on Old Durham Road in Gateshead, and you can contact them at their website, darrenbaldwinfunerals.co.uk. Email darren@darrenbaldwinfunerals.co.uk, or give them a call, 0191 478 2730. A big thanks to Media Arts for all the help with the technical side of things. And a big thanks to New Workwear. You can find them at newworkwear.com. If you want to help the channel, hit the thumb up to subscribe, hit the subscribe button, and share to your other social media. You can also pay a one-off fee of £25 to get a scarf, a cup, a pen, and a membership card. Go to the website, NUFCmatters.com, and click membership, or put your smartphone over this QR code. We also support the food bank on this channel. If you want to make some donations virtually, go to nufcfansfoodbank.co.uk and make a donation today. We're also a podcast on Spotify, iTunes, and other podcast providers. Just search NUFC Matters. I'm also a part of the Northeast Footy Brekkie Show. You can listen to that Monday to Friday, 7 till 9 at thetuneuk.com. We've also got an event coming up next year. It's in January the 19th at the Tyneside Irish Centre. It's an evening with Nobby Solano. Tickets are available on voucher for £20. Don't forget, Supermac and Gibbo do every pre-match at Louis Liquor Store. It's free entry, children welcome, and there is great food by Fed's Fried Chicken. They're usually on pre-match and sometimes post-match at Louis Liquor Store.
Okay, welcome back to the show. We've got about 15 minutes left. Just want to ask about Firmino. There's a lot of talk about Newcastle potentially tapping into a Saudi loan market, which had caused a little bit of a ripple, shall we say, in the media, especially with Newcastle's ownership being Saudis. But yeah, Firmino, it's an interesting one. Talk of him being loaned, potentially back out to a Premier League club. Fulham being mentioned in dispatches. Newcastle, of course, being linked because the need for a centre forward is, I would say, quite desperate, especially with Callum Wilson and Alexander Isak. Both missing out throughout this season already with injury. Is Firmino an option in this window, or could he be an option in the summer window? Maybe is it a permanent deal?
Well, I'm not aware of too much between Newcastle and Firmino at this point. But as you say, there is the need to find goals and a solution that's economical. Firmino isn't technically economical because of his wages. But if Al Ahly were prepared to shoulder the burden of the wages, then there might be something that could be done. And that's the same, by the way, for any of the Premier League clubs. Firmino would either have to take a pay cut, or alternatively, Al Ahly, his current parent club, would have to pay, I would say, at least 50% of the wages, because that's the sort of danger when a player goes to Saudi Arabia. They get their wage packet increased by 2, 3, 4 times. So Newcastle are not going to be able to afford Firmino's wages if it was a loan that required them to pay 100%. So Al Ahly are going to basically have to do a prospective suitor a favour if there is to be a loan of Firmino. And it's an interesting one because the Saudi side are adamant, the deal makers, this is the Ministry of Sport and PIF, that they want to try and keep Firmino in Saudi because the optics of him going anywhere else mid-season are poor. And that lends itself towards a move to another Saudi club on loan with Al Shabab and Al Ittifaq interested. But again, from a budgetary point of view, those are not as big a clubs. They need Al Ahly to pay the vast majority, if not 100% of the wages. But then you have the Firmino perspective. And the feeling with Firmino is that for the right opportunity, he would move in January. He would want to leave Saudi Arabia. He's not enjoying his time there. He's on the bench. He doesn't fit in with the system. So maybe he does want to draw a line under the situation. And that's the kind of interesting debate in all of this. who wins that conversation between Firmino's desire and deal makers in Saudi Arabia. And maybe there is no winner, and maybe he just sits on the bench at Al Ahly until the end of the season and then leaves. So I'm not really aware, a bit like with Neves, of too much between Newcastle and Firmino. Sheffield United made an inquiry, but under Paul Heckingbottom. So there might be a different perspective now that Chris Wilder is in charge. And Fulham and Nottingham Forest are two other interesting possibilities for Firmino as well. He's got interest in Turkey and interest in Italy as well. So he's not short of options, but the options mean nothing if the Saudi deal makers don't want him moving outside of Saudi Arabia in January. So it's a neat link with Newcastle, but I don't think that St James's Park is the most likely destination, even with the shared PIF aspects between the clubs.
De Gea was linked before Christmas as well. He's still currently a free agent. Is De Gea another, maybe he's a red herring in there? Newcastle maybe not making a move for a goalkeeper. Dubravka, of course, come in, being involved in some fairly, crazy games over the last few weeks where goals have gone in left, right and centre. And question marks are always going to come across a goalkeeper when you concede that many goals in games. But, is that a position, do you think Newcastle could strengthen in the window?
Goalkeeper's a possibility. I mean, Eddie Howe's on record as saying, but we spoke about this before, how gave those comments that there's just a lot of faith in Martin Dubravka. And I don't see that necessarily changing. I must say that despite in the end losing and conceding 4 against Liverpool, I thought Dubravka was brilliant for large parts of that game. I think he made about 10 saves. And had Newcastle got a penalty, or had Liverpool not been given what I thought was a very poor penalty, they might have somehow got something out of that game. And then maybe people wouldn't have been talking about the conceding 4 goals. So I think that Dubravka did okay in that game. I don't think Ramsdale is going to be possible unless the player really pushes. And I think that De Gea is a tough one because he still wants high wages. And everyone knows that by maybe March, Nick Pope will be back. So anybody that joins Newcastle United now in, let's call it mid-January at the earliest, unless they're prepared to do a short-term deal until only the end of the season, whether that's loan or whether that's signing, almost in De Gea's sense, in a game-by-game basis, they know that if they're a top keeper like De Gea still, they're going to be falling down the pecking order. And I think that is really difficult in many ways. So you need the right kind of personality. I wonder whether Kasper Schmeichel will come into the mix as well for Newcastle. It's actually Sheffield United looking at the moment, and they're trying to wrap that one up quickly because they expect other interest. But that's the kind of name and character I think might be quite useful to Newcastle, and he might be prepared to just do something until the end of the season. But at the end of the day, Nick Pope is the number 1 at Newcastle. So is Schmeichel, for the sake of a few weeks, better than Dubravka or Karras? Is De Gea even going to be better than Dubravka for the sake of a few weeks? And maybe with the cost involved, Newcastle just decide no. So clearly they're looking at the goalkeepers market because you have to do your due diligence. But that doesn't take away from the fact that Eddie Howe has a lot of confidence in Dubravka. And even though he conceded 4 against Liverpool, as I said before, I think that Dubravka showed what he was capable of in that game and did make some very good saves.
It's an interesting one. Certainly, Eddie playing his cards very close to his chest and, not giving too much away. Is there anything on the agenda that you potentially feel, could happen over the course of the January transfer window for Newcastle? I think it's going to be, generally speaking, and listening to the transfer shows on the various networks, quite a quiet January across the board, potentially because of the Everton 10 points deduction. Clubs are getting a little bit of nervousness within them. Obviously, there are some clubs in the Premier League who are shall we say, for want of a better expression, staring down the barrel of a gun, potentially with losing points. We've got Man City, we've got Manchester United have been in and out of trouble. We've got Chelsea, not Forest, of course, look as if they're going to avoid any punishment for the paperwork issue that they had with John Joe Shelby. But are there any potential transfers, you think, in the offing for Newcastle? Is there one or two that we should maybe look at, as opposed to these names that have been, paraded in the media?
I think it's just central midfield. And I think if they can find a central midfielder who perhaps isn't Calvin Phillips, that's the target position that they'll go for. I've said it already, I would keep half an eye on Andre Santos. But the challenge is that Chelsea need game time. And Newcastle's midfield, actually, when you look at it, does to some extent pick itself, in the sense that Joe Linton's not playing in the front three. Now, remember, when you look at the need for goals and a striker, he could go further forwards. That is an option. But if he's in the midfield, and if Bruno is fit and in the midfield, then there's only one other space. And you've still got Elliot Anderson, who has had his own injury problems. You've got Lewis Miley. You've got Sean Longstaff. So is Andre Santos going to play every week for Newcastle between now and the end of the season? And if Chelsea think no, they're not going to entertain that and it becomes a non-starter. But he's the one I'd keep half an eye on. Palace are interested. Loads of championship clubs, Ipswich, Leeds. The other thing, though, is that Leslie Ukwachuku is out until mid-February. So that might mean that Chelsea even keep hold of Santos now, even though a few weeks ago they were planning to bring him back from Forest and loan him out. But it's going to be difficult for Newcastle because with that kind of name, as I said before, they've seen a loan spell at Forest not work and him have no game time. So Newcastle can shout until they're blue in the face and say, we'll give him more minutes, but then they can still not, in the same way that Lewis Hall's not had any minutes either. So I think that's a tough one because it's not just about Newcastle's want, it's about Chelsea's need, because that will only ever be a straight loan. But he is a long-standing Newcastle target that they've looked at in the past before Chelsea signed him. So it could be one to watch between now and the end of the window.
Okay, last 5 or 6 minutes. Let's go back to where we started. We started with the big derby, which, of course, with this being a pre-record, is taking place today. Newcastle United are away to Sunderland in the FA Cup. It is a 12:45 kickoff. Newcastle backed by 6,000 supporters who will be in the upper and lower tiers of the North Stand. This is our largest ever following at the Stadium of Light. The allocation was conditional on fans travelling by bus. So this is a so-called bubble match. And fans are being transported as the show goes out from St James's Park down to the Stadium of Light. There are bars in Newcastle City Centre showing this on the television and giving free entry. In particular, Pumphrey's in the Big Market, the Dog and Parrot on Clayton Street West. If you're around the Oosburn area, then Little Buildings on Stepney Bank is televising it today as well. Team news. It wasn't good news from Newcastle, but it was expected that Callum Wilson wouldn't miss this game. He's now got a calf injury, and it's looking likely that he will also miss the Manchester City game. The good news is he will be back for the fixture against Aston Villa as long as his recovery goes well. There is a fitness test, or was a fitness test on Friday for Kieran Trippier, who's had a little issue with his groin. So news will be delivered to the St James's Park faithful at the Stadium of Light an hour before kickoff as to whether he is available. Fingers crossed for that. Could it be Kieran Trippier over the wall? Been a few of them in derby games. And there is no hint of a return yet for Elliot Anderson, Harvey Barnes, Jacob Murphy, or Joe Willock. How are Sunderland going to line up? Who's missing? Well, Bradley Dack and Dennis Serkin are both injured. Jack Diamond obviously remains unavailable due to his ongoing trial at Newcastle Crown Court. And the Sunderland team warmed up with this for the FA Cup tie with a 2-0 home win over Preston North End in the Championship on Monday. I watched the game, impressed with the way Sunderland handled it. I thought they played well. What does a derby need? Well, it needs a strong referee. Have we got one? Craig Pawson is the South Yorkshire official. He's taken charge of this game. And he has been involved in one Newcastle fixture this season, and that was the 1-0 Premier League home victory over Brentford. As we discussed earlier, no VAR for this game, which, you know mine and Ben's opinions on that. But this is it. The first derby in 8 years, 53 in victories. That excludes friendlies. So winner takes it all. Who knows when we will meet again. But Newcastle travelling to Sunderland, hoping to get one up on their rivals and get into the fourth round. Live on ITV, for those of you who have staying in the house. Okay, then. Big questions. What are you expecting from this game, Ben, first of all?
Well, I think Newcastle will win, and I think Newcastle will put out an incredibly strong team. And I think that they have to win because the FA Cup is a big priority this season. I think that Sunderland will create a very fierce atmosphere, as you would expect. And I think we'll get a full-blooded derby. But I expect Newcastle to score first in the game. And if they do, then they can go on and win it. I think that it's going to be really important that Newcastle dictate the pace. And I think it's going to be really important that they almost don't get sucked into a derby. I think they need to ensure that it becomes a football match, not a kind of fiery, ugly, physical game. And the intensity and the pace of the game has to be defined by Newcastle. They can't allow Sunderland to get their foot on the ball early. And if Newcastle do that, I think they can score 2 or 3 and maybe win by 3-1. I think both sides will score in the game. I think that Isak's going to be important, as is Gordon. And I think Joe Linton might continue to play in that front three. I think Miley will start the game. And obviously Botman at the back is a big plus as well to try and shut Sunderland out. I hope Livramento gets a start as well. I think it's his kind of game. And the last thing I'd say is Newcastle just need to watch their discipline, because I think against Newcastle, too many players were picking up yellows. I think Miley was booked, Longstaff was booked, Bruno was booked, Bravka was booked. I think Joe Linton picked up a booking as well. So they got to cut that out, because if they allow this to become a derby atmosphere, fiery, confrontational, if they allow feet to linger, if they allow shirt pulling, if they do silly things, pick up silly bookings, then they risk giving Sunderland an advantage, because I think that's exactly the kind of game that Sunderland will be looking for. So they almost have to not get sucked into the derby atmosphere. And if they do that, I think they can win the derby comfortably.
Yeah, it's a big, big game, and discipline is key. That is my worry, Bruno or Joe Linton being sent off. It really is. I think Newcastle need to score early. I think Newcastle need to nullify the crowd. The crowd will be well up for this. But double the amount of supporters from Newcastle are going to be there. That's going to make a big difference. And if Newcastle can get a goal in front and Isak can maybe tap the ball into the bottom of the net and get Newcastle 1-0 up, that crowd's going to turn on Sunderland. That's what happens, I'm afraid. It happens at St James's Park. It happens at the Stadium of Light. I'm going to go for a 2-1 win, Ben. What about you?
3-1 to Newcastle, I think. I think they'll score a couple of goals in the first sort of hour or so. Sunderland will get one back. They'll go for the draw, and Isak will hit them on the counter-attack. So 3-1 Newcastle for me.
Great stuff, Ben. We'll have you back next week. Obviously, looking at the transfer window and seeing whether Newcastle are going to do any business. But for now, Ben, have a great weekend. Take care, mate.
Look forward to it. Enjoy the derby, everyone.